All right, I'm going to get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is ACEs and the LGBTQ community. My name is Beckett, Lansbury. I work as the Sexual Violence Prevention Coordinator for Family Services, and I'm really excited to have you all here. This is a really important, I think, a really important topic and a pretty big passion of mine. Speaking about the LGBTQ community, especially our experiences with trauma. So thank you all for being here. I am going to say that if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to type them into the chat. Jen is here. Jen will let me know if I miss anything. And there's going to be a few instances where I might ask for participation. I'll give a few seconds to let folks type in. You don't feel pressured to participate if you don't want to. And I also see that, I'm not sure if anybody's on just on the phone call and can't see the screen. I'll try to explain if there's any visuals, but if I can't explain it the full, so sorry about that in advance. But let's just get started. All right. So our objective for today is to build capacity around understanding how ACEs and trauma affect the LGBTQ+ community throughout our lifetimes, and also what can we do to build protective environments for LGBTQ folks. I just wanted to make a note. You'll see that I spelled folks F-O-L-X. I try to use inclusive language whenever speaking in general, but particularly when speaking about the LGBTQ community. And the term folks with KS is already inclusive. And adding the X just gives that little bit extra inclusivity, saying that this is a conscious choice to put an X there to make sure that we are speaking about everybody collectively. All right, so I'm going to ask for a little bit of participation. Just to get started, we're speaking about the LGBTQ community, which is a pretty large community that encompasses a lot of different people. We'll go through exactly who these folks are and what identities might be included, but just to start, this is one of the larger acronyms that I know of for the community. It's pretty encompassing. So just to get an idea about our familiarity, if folks could type into the chat, if you notice any letter in this acronym that looks familiar to you, what is that letter? All right, so I see lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, right? So LGBT. Queer, right, for Q. Right. All right, so we have somebody saying is 2S, two-spirit, asexual, pansexual. I only ever knew LGBTQ. All right, some look familiar, not sure about IP. Awesome, well, no worries, we're gonna go through all of them. And also just remember that this is absolutely not a fully encompassing list. There's so many identities, the language is always evolving. So this is not exhaustive, but yeah, intersex, ace, and error, great. So definitely a lot of people who are very familiar with a lot of these terms. So let's move forward. So quite a few folks did say a lot of these terminology, or a lot of the terms up here. So we have L, lesbian, which is somebody who identifies as a woman who's attracted to other women, or folks who identify as women. Gay is a term that has been used pretty broadly to talk about the queer community, but also is used specifically to talk about folks who identify as men who are attracted to other folks who identify as men. Bisexual is used because of how we know how expansive gender is. Bisexual has been used to say that you're attracted to both genders or both sexes, but there's more than, we'll kind of get into that, but there are more than two genders and more than two sexes. So bisexual is, I usually think of it as you're attracted to your own gender and other genders. Transgender are folks who do not identify with the gender or the sex they were assigned at birth. So they identify as a gender other than that. Transsexual, I added here because I think it's an important historical term. Currently, it's not widely used. There are members of the LGBTQ community that do use transsexual, so that's why I put it up here. I do think it's important to be fully encompassing of those individuals, but just to keep in mind, the term transsexual is complicated because it has to do with this idea of this medicalization of being transgender, and the idea of you are transsexual if you have these medical interventions such as hormone replacement therapy or surgeries, which not everybody has access to or wants to. So the term transsexual, some folks do use it, and absolutely, like, full respect and power to anybody who wants to have that term and identifies with that term, but just kind of for general knowledge, not a term necessarily blanket, not a term used as a blanket statement for anyone. Queer is kind of similar. Queers used to be a derogatory term, and it can still be utilized as one, but is being reclaimed. So folks, I will usually refer to the LGBTQ community as the queer community, with keeping in mind that there are individuals in that community who do not identify with that term. So as we know, language is always evolving. Intersex are a group of folks who, when they're born, the doctor does not feel comfortable determining whether or not they fit into the box of male or female. There's a lot more complexities and a lot of history with intersex folks. They're hugely discriminated against, and there has been practices where doctors will just, if a baby is born, the doctor doesn't quote unquote know which box his child fits into. Some doctors have in the past just performed surgery with or without the parents' consent or knowledge. Pansexual is a term used to refer to folks who are attracted to folks not based on their gender, just based on other attributes of them. Two-spirit, someone says 2S is two-spirit, and two-spirit is a term used by indigenous groups to say that they have two spirits, a masculine spirit and a feminine spirit. I'm not by any means an expert on this identity. Agender, the term a is used to say away from or absent of. So both agender and asexual have to do with agender. You don't identify with having a gender, and asexual, you are not attracted to anybody sexually. Gender nonconforming are folks that identify as gender nonconforming. They don't conform to what we think about when we think of standard gender, just standard gender roles. And non-binary are folks that don't identify within the binary of male and female. So kind of long-winded. I hope that was clear. I think it's important to go over these different identities just so we can kind of have an idea about how expansive this community is and who's involved with it. But also remember that language is constantly changing, and that somebody will have different could have a different idea about what one of these terms mean for themselves personally. So I hope that was clear. This is to kind of illustrate that when we talk about the LGBTQ community, we are talking about sexuality and gender, which are two separate instances. Someone's sexuality does not determine their gender, and vice versa. Somebody's gender does not determine their sexuality. Yet, folks who are bisexual, whose sexuality is not the normative, which is heterosexual, and folks whose gender is not the normative, which is cisgender, both are included under the LGBTQ community. And so this is kind of an expanded version. So, we have sexuality and gender kind of lumped together, but in this second umbrella, I'm using the term queer, which again, I have comfortability using, and quite a few folks in the LGBTQ community do have comfort using, but of course, always respect to folks who don't identify with that term. But this is just illustrating, the expanse of these terms, that under this queer umbrella, we're talking about, folks who can identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, and then also folks who identify as transgender, gender nonconforming, non-binary, agender, two-spirit, and that people can identify with a sexuality and a gender, both under the queer community, both under the queer umbrella. All right, hope we're doing well so far. Again, if you have any questions, just feel free to type them into the chat box. All right, and so now we're just going to go through a quick Gender 101. This is just to make sure that we're all on the basic same page of when we're talking about LGBTQ folks. So I spoke about sex and sex assigned at birth. So this is a phrase to use intentionally to recognize somebody's assigned sex and not their gender identity. And usually assigned sex only concerns three categories: female, male, and intersex, which I mentioned before. And just a reminder that legal documentation will usually list someone's sex, not their gender identity. Oh, I think someone's mic is on. All right. So sexual orientation is how a person characterizes their emotional, spiritual, and sexual attraction to others. Gender identity does not determine someone's sexuality, and vice versa, as I said before. Gender identity is a person's internal sense of self of being man, male, woman, female, both, neither, transgender, or other gender, or another gender completely. And then gender expression is the way in which a person acts, dresses, speaks, grooms, behave, that we categorize into masculine, feminine, androgynous. And gender expression does not necessarily correspond to a sex assigned at birth or gender identity. It's just how somebody is expressing themselves. So now we'll move forward a little bit. So speaking a lot, just to get an idea about who we're talking about when we speak about the queer community. And so now we're actually going to start speaking about trauma within the queer community. And I wanted to highlight this framework or this lens that a lot of time trauma within the queer community is looked at through. There's this idea that members of the queer community live at-risk lifestyles and engage in risky behavior. I want to try to shift that frame within this conversation to look at the environment that queer folks grow up in and live in, and that environment is actually what causes folks who are marginalized to live what we think of as quote unquote at-risk lifestyles and engage in what we think of as risky behavior. So just keeping in mind that this shifting the frame is putting the weight, taking the weight off of the queer community to shift their behavior, and instead is us looking at the environment and going, what is happening within this environment that these folks are being put at so much risk. All right, so just to kind of give some props as to why this is so important, this was a study that was conducted, and research basically is showing that members of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, the LGBTQ community, are more likely to experience potentially traumatizing events, mental and physical health problems, and discrimination due to their actual and perceived sexuality and or gender identity throughout their lifetime. So this is basically saying that the LGBTQ community is more likely to experience trauma and traumatizing events based on their actual or perceived. So whether or not they actually are in the queer community, but or somebody knows who their identity within the queer community, the basic idea of this is that the queer community are much more likely to experience traumatizing events based on the fact that they are part of the queer community based on their sexuality or gender. And this is also expansive throughout someone's lifetime. And this study was conducted based on LGBTQ folks self-identifying their potential traumatizing events and also self-identifying any mental, physical health problems or discrimination that they faced. So we know that LGBTQ community does experience trauma throughout their lifetime. And we also know that children experience a lot of trauma throughout their lifetime. So in the United States, more than 2/3 of children report experiencing some sort of traumatic event by age 16. And approximately 2 out of 3 children and youths age 17 and younger are exposed to some form of violent victimization at home or in the community in the past year. And 50% had more than one exposure, so polys, multiple exposures. This was conducted, this was a study conducted in 2015, so a few years ago. So now I'm going to bring up this idea of adverse child experiences, or ACEs. ACEs are a way to measure the trauma in someone's life. So ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, are potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood. ACEs include aspects of a child's environment that can undermine their safety, stability, and bonding. ACEs are linked to chronic health problems, including physical ailments, behavioral mental challenges, substance misuse. ACEs are common. About 61% of adults report that they have experienced at least one type of ACE, and we'll get into what these are. And nearly 1 in 6 have reported they've experienced 4 or more ACEs. This is from a study done in 2019. And we also know, so we have, that they're traumatic events. They do include aspects of a child's environment. They're linked to chronic health problems. They're extremely common, but they can also be prevented by creating safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments. ACEs can be prevented. So just to give a little bit of background of what ACEs are, their adverse child experiences, and what these could include in certain types of abuse, neglect, or household dysfunctions. So physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse as a young child, physical and emotional neglect, mental illness, then within the household, somebody having a mental illness, an incarcerated relative, a mother who's treated violently, or substance abuse, or divorce. These are seen to be linked to an increase in what we determine as risky behavior. So lack of physical activity, smoking, alcoholism, drug misuse, missing work, and then a variety of different physical and mental health problems. So just as a few slides ago I said, ACEs are common. So this is a study done by the CDC. So you know, there's a high volume of folks that had one ACE, high volume of folks that had 2, 3, 4 or more, higher volume. And we see that the types of ACEs do vary, but there's a very high percentage of folks that do have had experience with substance use or substance misuse, physical abuse, parental separation, sexual abuse, mental illness, et cetera, et cetera. And we also know that ACEs, the number of ACEs increases, so does the risk for these negative health outcomes. So the idea is the more ACEs or the more adverse child experiences that you're exposed to, the higher probability is that you might have a higher risk of some sort of negative health outcome that was listed on the slide previously. So keeping in mind everything we know about ACEs, so among LGBTQ youth, rates of exposure to potentially traumatic events are even higher than for their heterosexual and cisgender peers. And we already saw that a huge percentage of youth are already exposed to trauma. So it's even higher in the LGBTQ community. There are specific types of trauma that LGBTQ youth experience, including discrimination, harassment, and abuse based on their actual perceived sexual orientation or gender identity, just to reiterate that. That these specific experiences these kids are experiencing them because of who they are, their sexuality or their gender. Seeking help is a dangerous act. This is a quote from a self-identified trans attendee at the 2019 SUNY Spectrum Conference, and I think it sums up the experience of the LGBTQ community, but especially I believe LGBTQ youth, that seeking help is dangerous. So I'm going to go through a few statistics. I'm a big statistics guy. I really like numbers. I know not everybody is necessarily on the same page with that. Not everybody likes looking at numbers. So I'll try to make sure that I'm giving a little bit of an idea about why I'm choosing these numbers to show and what makes them so important. So just keeping in mind that the trauma that LGBT youth are experiencing as a result of their sexuality or their gender identity. 88% of LGBTQ youth received information about safe sex that was irrelevant to them as an LGBTQ person. So a huge percentage of these LGBTQ youth are receiving information about safe sex that they can't apply within their life. Over half of trans and gender expansive youth say they can never use a school restroom that align with their gender identity. So from a lot of experience working with trans youth, these kids are holding their bathroom. They're not able to go pee for 7 to 8 hours a day, if not more. Out of both, the inability to use a bathroom that correlates with their gender, and also out of fear of using that bathroom, either bathroom. Over 70% of LGBTQ youth report feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness. That's huge. So one thing that I really try to think about is, imagine if these percentages were not necessarily just talking about LGBTQ youth, but talking about just children and youth in general. So 88% of youth receiving safe sex information that was irrelevant to them, half of youth saying they can never use a bathroom that aligns with their gender identity, and 70% of youth report feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness. That's a travesty. It's absolutely horrible. And so it's just as horrible if, with a small marginal group of children, these percentages are extremely high. Only 13% of LGBTQ youth report hearing positive messages about being LGBTQ in school. So these kids are not hearing that their identities are being validated within the space they have to be in all the time. Only 26% of LGBTQ youth report that they always feel safe in their classroom. Nearly half of LGBTQ youth do not feel they fit in their communities. So these kids are already marginalized based on their identities and are being even more marginalized in these spaces they have to be in their classrooms and their communities. So 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ+. The total homeless youth community is approximately 1.7 million, which is already just absolutely abhorrent. So 40% of these youth that are homeless are LGBTQ. And while LGBTQ youth only make up 5 to 10% of the youth population at large, is approximately 42 million. So there's a huge disparity there. 43% of youth were forced from their homes due to conflict related to their sexual orientation or gender identity. And one thing to keep in mind here is that this is only reported numbers. This is only the percentage of LGBTQ youth that we know are out there, that we know that are self-identifying as LGBTQ, and that are also being found to have these statistics. And usually these statistics about youth are reported through schools. So just keeping in mind how many students might, or how many kids might not have access to schools to be counted. The risk of LGBTQ youth report homelessness is 120% higher than their heterosexual and cisgender peers, harkening back to the fact that a huge percentage, almost half of them, were forced from their homes due to conflicts related to sexual orientation and gender identity, being forced from their homes, not losing their homes. 32% of LGBTQ youth have experienced a form of abuse at home related to their sexual orientation or gender identity. So if they're not being forced from their homes, there's then abuse going on within the home, which is yet another reason for these youth to leave the home and become homeless. So exposure to both impersonal and interpersonal potentially traumatic events are positively correlated with shame, depression symptoms, PTSD symptoms, substance use, chronic health conditions, and somatic symptoms. This is, hopefully this point should sound kind of reiterating. This is really just like layering on the facts that this idea of trauma and the shame are related with these higher risk outcomes. And the environment that we're creating for these folks from time of their youth all the way up through past adulthood. So this is saying that exposure to both like impersonal, so not directed at an individual, and interpersonal, directed at individual traumatic events are positively correlated with shame. So the more of these potentially traumatic events that happen, the higher likelihood and correlation that these folks will experience depression symptoms, PTSD symptoms, misuse drugs, have chronic health conditions, and have somatic symptoms. Somatic symptoms, as for anybody who needs it, are could be gastrointestinal issues, fatigue, pain, anything like that. So as we just said, so shame is positively correlated with these symptoms. This was done by, this was a study where folks, again, I'd mentioned it before, self-identified their own trauma and their own the symptoms they were experiencing. So participants who identified as folks of color reported greater exposure to interpersonal, potentially traumatic events and shame than white participants, which should not be a shock to anyone. So folks of color are experiencing much more interpersonal, so directed potential traumatic events than white participants. And TGNC, which is transgender, gender nonconforming folks, reported greater exposure to both interpersonal and impersonal potentially traumatic events, along with greater somatic and depressive symptoms than cisgender participants. So even within the queer community, there is this, there are LGBTQ folks, so folks that are lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, gay, who are not transgender, are experiencing lower rates, but not lower in terms, not that it shouldn't be, taken seriously, and that it's not, a horrible event that's happening, but the trans folks are experiencing greater exposure to interpersonal, impersonal traumatic events than cisgender participants. So this idea of the gender identity is causing folks to be at higher risks of violence or traumatic events, and then higher risk of these depressive and greater somatic symptoms. So shame partially mediated the relationship between exposure to traumatic events and negative mental and physical health symptoms. Exposure to these events is associated with greater levels of shame, and that greater levels of shame in turn is associated with worse mental and physical health conditions. So the relationship between having trauma and these negative mental and physical health symptoms is creating shame, and these traumatic events are creating shame. And so then this shame that our community is experiencing is then in turn associated with much worse health symptoms for folks. So it's all just piling on each other. So, and then looking to adults, we've been speaking a lot about youth. LGBTQ adults do report experiencing much higher rates of victimization, up to 2 times higher for sexual and physical abuse, and about 1.5 times higher for emotional abuse during their childhood. So we looked at youth statistics, and we're seeing, okay, youth are being traumatized. Let's look at adults. Adults, again, they are reporting, yes, like throughout childhood, we were also experiencing sexual, physical, and emotional abuses at higher rates than our peers. And they're also, and then as adults, they're 1.6 to 3.9 times at greater risk of PTSD, often related to these childhood experiences, as well as depression, suicidality, and substance misuse, which again is harkening back to the conversation about shame that we just had, where everything is really just piling on each other and just is creating this environment where these folks, based on our sexuality and gender identities, the environment that you grow up in is creating a much higher likelihood that you're going to experience traumatic events, and then have a much more likelihood to have greater health risks. So this is looking at healthcare access. So it all appeared at once. I was going to try to make this slide a little bit less busy by having them come up one at a time. That didn't work. No problem. So let's just go one at a time. So the first thing to look at is this is a study done by the Pride Agenda, looking at healthcare access for LGBTQ folks. Keeping in mind that we're talking about health outcomes and the great risk that all these traumatic events are putting on LGBTQ folks. There also is like a huge disparity with their access then to getting healthcare based on all these higher risks that they're experiencing. So let's look at age. Right, we have a huge variety of different age ranges that we're looking at right now, with the highest percentage being 25 to 44. And also the second highest percentage being 16 to 24. So a little younger teens involved, some youth involved. So we're just going to go from the top down. Let's first look at healthcare access. I circled 33% of no home health. And we'll get to that in a moment. But so 8% don't have access because they have no insurance. A lot of folks have no primary care provider, no usual source of care. They can't get access because they've missed care due to cost over the last 12 months. And such a high percentage have no home health. No home health is for folks that have multiple health ailments that need specific care. I thought this percentage was very interesting because looking at all the information we just viewed about how trauma influences the health risks that LGBTQ folks will grow up to potentially experience. We can imagine that there's multiple ailments they're experiencing based on the trauma they've experienced. So they have multiple ailments, multiple health needs. That's what home health home is used for. It's for folks that need multiple aspects of care. And so a huge percentage of folks don't have access to the home health, and probably also because a huge percentage of folks need that extra care and need that more health care based on their traumatic events in life. For barriers to care, I thought it was interesting how there's a little bit of variance between 24 to 33%, but basically it was pretty evenly distributed. That the barriers that folks are experiencing are there's not a lot of psychological support groups, no personal, they don't have personal finance resources. There's not enough professional health providers that are competent with LGBTQ community. Community fear or dislike of the LGBTQ community will make folks not look and seek out care and health, or access, or like a lack of access because of to LGBTQ medical facilities. I know that in my experience, I have traveled probably 2 hours. So I've traveled up to 100 miles to find LGBTQ sensitive medical facilities. Just because of not knowing where the access to any of my current area. And then economic vulnerabilities. So we have a huge percentage of folks that are under 200% of poverty line that are currently, and then a huge percentage also that are non-employed or in school. So that can create some economic vulnerabilities for them. You know, as we're seeing a huge percentage of LGBTQ folks experience homelessness, that creates economic vulnerabilities. And then in the last year, also a huge amount of folks had food insecurity, making them unable to access healthcare, and also were insecure with their housing, so they were having trouble paying for their other utilities, let alone being able to access healthcare. There we go. Sorry, we got frozen there for a second. There we go. So what has been done? This was really one of the questions I was looking at because I was reading all these statistics. It was pretty relevant to me, pretty prevalent that, okay, obviously there's an issue, there's a huge issue going on. So what is going on? What has been done? And kind of as I stated before, how I want to shift the frame of this conversation, supporting the health of LGBTQ folks is usually involved in trying to understand and reduce factors that increase their risk. Much less attention has been paid to protective factors. So we're seeing that there are these huge risks that this community is involved with. And a lot of the support and a lot of the time has been trying to understand and reduce these factors versus looking at what can we do instead of to reduce risk factors, how can we build up protective factors, which will then in turn, you know, mitigate and reduce risk factors. So how we build these protective environments for folks instead of just looking at what behavior to mitigate. How can we make it so folks won't have to go to those behaviors or feel like they have to go to those behaviors because the community is there supporting them. So what can be done? So the first step to creating any kind of change is through your own education, which we're doing here, which we're doing through our reading, through our jobs, interacting with folks. As you educate yourself with issues, as you can see, gaps within systems can become extremely obvious. So currently, there's a lot of emphasis on risk factors over protective factors in the LGBTQ community. There's a lot of emphasis on the sexual activity of LGBTQ youth and the risks that they're taking. But as we saw in a previous slide, a huge amount of LGBTQ youth can't relate with the sexual health they're being given in school. So how can they know how to engage in sexual activity protectively or safely? There's also a huge emphasis on adult trauma and their at-risk lifestyles, again, without looking towards the environments these folks are growing up in. And there's also a lack of focus in general on ACE's prevalence in the LGBTQ youth. They know that there's abuses, but there's not necessarily a huge focus on, let's see how much abuse are these kids experiencing and the full extent of it without having to pull from all these different sources. Just one source saying we're going to take a hard look at what adverse child experiencing these kids are facing. I put this quote in many of my presentations. I think it's extremely prevalent, and it's just I think it's the perfect example of kind of what we're seeing. Where queer people don't grow up as ourselves. We grow up playing a version of ourselves that sacrifices authenticity to minimize humiliation and prejudice. The massive task of our adult lives is to unpick which parts of ourselves are truly us and which parts we've created to protect us. So this is a socio-ecological model. It's basically illustrating the different spheres of influence and these levels of influence. And the idea is that behaviors in society of the individual are shaped kind of by these spheres. So we have the individual sphere, the relationship with impersonal sphere, community, and then societal, which is more policy-based. So I have a few slides here of just what actions we can take in each of these spheres. So if we're looking at that individual sphere, the individual action, what can you do? You can assess your own values, beliefs, and assumptions regarding sexual orientation, gender identity, and LGBTQ youth. You can address your own internal biases. You can educate yourself. You can apologize if you make a mistake. The asterisk is there to remind us not to over apologize. This comes up a lot where if you misgender somebody, if you're speaking with someone you don't know that you've assumed their gender, you refer to them as a name they're not they don't use, or as the pronoun that they don't use either. There's this tendency to over apologize to make the person know that you didn't mean to make the LGBTQ person know that the person who made the mistake didn't know, like, and just over apologizing. You don't need to do that. There's no need to over apologize. The best thing you can do if you make a mistake, I actually probably should have put the thing here, is to acknowledge it, apologize, correct yourself, and move on. That's the best thing you can do. Acknowledge it. You acknowledge you made a mistake, whether or not you acknowledge it yourself or somebody else made you acknowledge it. You apologize. I'm so sorry I did that. Correct it, and you move on. And the best thing you can do then from that point forward is to, continuously make sure that you're not going back and making that mistake. And if you're noticing that you are, misgendering somebody or making that mistake a lot, that's a really great time for some self-reflection to see, okay, what is happening to make it so I continuously misgender this person? And then knowing your personal limits and being honest about them. That's a wonderful thing to be able to do. If you're having struggles with pronouns, or you're having questions about gender, someone's gender identity, or not understanding some aspect of it, it's good to know that personal limitation of yourself, and it's good to know and reflect that within yourself and be honest about it. Because we're all working through this. We're all, learning and learning new things, learning new terminology, learning new ways to address folks. So the best thing we can do is really just be honest and open about where we are in this journey. So interpersonal or relationship actions, so things you can do with other folks. You can lose, and this is really this is a model behavior. So you can use inclusive language, so referring to folks as partner, if you're addressing a group, everyone, folks, y'all, friends, just not, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Yeah. You can respect other self-identification, self-determination, so don't question somebody if they tell you what their name is and they tell you their pronoun. That's their name and their pronoun. You can self-identify your own pronouns in emails, name tags, meetings, etc., regardless of the fact if you are within the LGBTQ community. It is huge to normalize pronouns, because the fact is that everybody has pronouns, and we actually don't know someone's pronouns unless they tell you what their pronouns are. If you do, you're assuming their pronouns, and you won't actually know unless they tell you. So by self-identifying pronouns, it's normalizing it. And so it's making it so it's not just the trans people who are putting their pronouns on everything, which then makes it, can be a little exposing if you're the only person putting your pronouns on something and you're trans. It can be a little revealing. So normalizing it is a fantastic practice. Avoid assuming anyone's sexual orientation or gender identity. Confront discrimination and prejudice, jokes, comments, and generalizations specifically. Discrimination, prejudice does not only exist in overt acts. It's those small little interactions that we think, oh, it's not a big deal, and we just let that slip by. That's the moment to take a stand and actually say, that's not, either don't do that, or question them and say, like, what's so funny about that? Or why do you make that joke? Or what do you mean? Questioning somebody when they make one of those jokes, comments, or generalization usually makes that person think, because that joke, comment, or generalization is normalized within the environment they're living in. And a lot of the time, we don't think about why we're saying those jokes. And then avoid centering yourself in the conversation also. Not making it about you, making it about the conversation you're trying to have. So community and societal actions that can take. Ensuring that forms, materials, and procedures are inclusive and use inclusive language. Training staff in LGBT competency and anti-oppression work, connecting with LGBTQ services and providers and programs, reviewing employment or student policies and procedures and hiring staff reflective of community diversity, creating all gender non-segregated restrooms, and posting safe space symbols in organizational spaces, because that really does do a long way. Making the action to put up any kind of safe space symbol, a flag, anything like that, really does show that that somebody's going out of their way to say, like, this community is welcome here and accepted here, and I see you. So if you're still asking, what can I do? There is still so much to do. I have even more. So if what can families do to start mitigating these traumas? And what this kind of ending part of this presentation really is looking at that environmental and building up those protective factors. Because all of these instances that I'm mentioning, the absence of them is a potential trauma, is a potential instance where this LGBTQ person is going to be, exposed in an unsafe environment, the fear of being ridiculed could make them completely avert going to a space or seeking out a resource that they desperately need because they don't know if they're walking into a space that is accepting of them. So all of this is just building on like, what can we do? How can we make these? What actions can we take? I just feel like within these conversations, that's just one of the most important things to really try to get by. So what can families do? You can learn facts and be informed about issues that impact LGBTQ youth. Be aware of the LGBTQ inclusion policies that impact youth in our state, city, and local school districts. Advocate for LGBTQ inclusive curriculums, programming, and clubs, be that in schools, in programs, and organizations. Get involved with local LGBTQ organizations. There's so many, and I know Pride, Pride Month is, actually today's Pride Month. June is the first day of Pride. Pride Month, we're celebrating all, the community celebrating all month, even though we're going to be doing it as socially distanced. Anybody wants any information about what's happening, there's going to be information going on about how folks can get involved. So, all right, there we go. And make your home also a safe and affirming space for LGBTQ youth, whether or not you have openly LGBTQ children at home. I think that's an extremely important one. You don't have to be an LGBTQ pro family or household. If you don't, you can do that without having LGBTQ kids. I know quite a few families that, in work that I do, work that I've done a few years ago, I've spoken to a lot of families where they don't necessarily have an LGBTQ youth, but they have their kids have friends that that might be experiencing trauma and in other areas that are related. And so I've spoken to a lot of families about like, what can they do like in their own household to make that student, when they come over, feel safe and secure. What can educators do? Be or not, just educator in general, whether you're working in a school environment or not. Establishing clear and inclusive policies that support LGBTQ youth. Providing annual LGBTQ inclusive trainings for all staff. Thank you. Oh, perfect. So Cheryl in the chat said the Kingston LGBT Center has extensive list of virtual activities. Awesome. Thank you. I read, this is how it always is. I'm so perfect. Thank you all. Yeah, any resources that anybody has, feel free, put them in the chat. For me, for everybody listening, all of it's great. All right, so be intentional about creating safe spaces for LGBTQ youth. I think this also goes to, if you're putting up, a sticker or a flag, to be inclusive of not just youth, but folks in general. Be intentional when you're doing that. It's, you can just put it up, but also know that you're putting it up. That's a pretty big symbol. It's a visualization of your acceptance in that space. So just, be intentional and knowing that you are creating that space. Be a visible advocate for LGBTQ inclusion and equality. Provide educational resources to teachers, parents, students, anybody who you're involved with. Educational resources are always phenomenal, as we're doing right now in this chat. What can health professionals do? Be open to discussing sexual orientation and gender identity. A lot of the time, LGBTQ folks experience healthcare providers that are not open to talking about these very important aspects of our lives. Seek additional training to increase proficiency in LGBTQ issues, specific health needs, and disparities, because this community does have specific health needs they're experiencing. And so being aware and able to properly engage with that is phenomenal. Be an advocate for LGBTQ youth at all levels of healthcare. A lot of times you don't know what their rights are. They don't know what they have access to. They're not sure. And if you're LGBTQ on top of that, there's a whole other layer, because you're not seeing yourself reflected in so many material that's out there. So if LGBTQ folks in general, youth especially, but in general, do need advocacy in healthcare. It's extremely important. And then again, always provide educational resources for teachers, parents, and students, or anybody you interact with and involve yourself with. And then policymakers and advocacy leaders. Enact LGBTQ non-discrimination laws at national, state, and local levels if you have the ability to, or push for that. Advocate for LGBTQ inclusive anti-bullying laws and policies in schools. Support prohibitions of outdated and harmful practices such as conversion therapy. and promote protection in areas where LGBTQ youth are overrepresented, including youth homelessness services and the juvenile justice system. All right, so that was a lot of what to do and kind of how to take action. So we're kind of getting to the end of the presentation. This is a we're making good time actually. This is a video that it makes me emotional every time. So we'll see if I get emotional this time. I've seen it multiple times, and I feel like it hits home immediately. It illustrates this is what can happen if you create this protective environment for kids, and this is what it looks like. So I'm just gonna go over.
Ready? Take a deep breath. Sit up. Even if it doesn't feel true, remember that's what an affirmation is. We say something because we want to work on feeling good about ourselves. Okay.
Curious.
I'm curious.
I am hope.
I am hope.
Say I am love.
I am
Love.
I am love. I am loved deeply and unconditionally, just as I am.
I'm a drummer.
I'm a drummer.
I'm the king of all kings.
I am the king of all kings.
I am courageous.
I am courageous.
I am magic.
I'm magic.
I'm a boy.
I'm a boy.
I'll get back up.
I get back up. I can get back up again.
It's fine.
This body is strong.
I am ferocious.
I am who I am.
I know who I am.
I know who I am. I am beautiful. I am beautiful.
I am young and I can change the world.
I am young and I can change the world.
I am epic.
I am epic. I am eternal.
I am eternal.
I believe in acceptance for everyone.
I believe in acceptance for everyone. And then say moon baby.
You are my moon baby.
I am
That's not an affirmation, though.
Yes, it is.
All right.
Is it good? Wait, the snakes celebrate their birthday.
All right. I did get a little teary every time. Okay, so that is the ending. We do have a bit of time for just 10 minutes left, which is awesome. Sorry if I went a little fast. There's a lot of information to cover, and you're so welcome to use. Yeah, that video is it's moving. It's still I was trying to not cry. Yeah, it's rare. It's a beautiful video, and I really do think it kind of paints a picture of like this is what it looks like to support your kid. Then this is how easy it is. Just give them those affirmations. So that's it. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box. I'm so open to having any conversations or questions with y'all. And also, if you don't want to stay, oh, thank you, of course. Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, just let me know. You can also take your leave if you'd like to and email me. Thank you, Jenna. But I will stay here. And also, if anybody wants, oh, I'm so glad. I love that video. Yeah, it's beautiful. It's called like parents affirming their trans kids. If you get to see it.